All right, well, we're going to do a little bit more about zip forms and other things. One of the things you might like to notice when you go to car.org, there's a section here that says upcoming webinars and outreaches. Did you know that the CAR has classes and webinars? Did you know that? And one of the ones you might want to really check out is the Zip Forms Mobile. There's also one that they do for Zip Forms in a program called Zapier. And what Zapier does is it does things such as it'll take information that you put into Zip Forms and it'll put it in your Google Contacts or in some other contact database so you don't have to type things in twice. But if you wanted to know more about this, you could go to Education, Webinars, and Videos, and you're going to see a bunch of CAR videos for recorded webinars. Click here, and then here's a calendar. The mobile, your free CAR membership, right? Rebo Gateway is a paid-for program that, but here's another mobile one. The Showing Suite, here's more on Zip Forms, and if you keep looking, you're going to probably see anyhow, there's a bunch of recorded ones. My suggestion is that you might want to look at those, right? Isn't that true? Yeah. So we're going to, I know you all know about that. I mean, it's not like you pay a lot of money to the Association of Realtors, right? Isn't that cheap? Being a member of the union, isn't that cheap?
600?
Yeah, at least. Yeah. How much was it to renew this year? Six something? 650? Something like that. So you might as well use their stuff. Right. So we're in here. Why don't we, how many more disclosures do we have to talk about?
Disclosures.
Weren't we talking about disclosures?
We were.
So, and you remember which ones we talked about and which ones we haven't? No, you don't. Did I do a, let's just see, Untitled Sample, Wood Street. How about Michael Devlin? Well, here's one, Mike D.
You got as far as lead-based paint. Going down the list. I don't know what's after that.
There may not be anything after that. I think
Okay.
that's
We
it.
did carbon monoxide, lead-based paint.
Yeah, we did that.
Stuff.
So I believe what I was doing, and by the way, we were talking about documents and document storage and all that. All of the files that involve documents that I'm using on a regular basis are in my copy.com folder. So if I archive something, I move it into Dropbox. If I'm collaborating or it's something that I want to access from a mobile device, I have it in Google Drive. Right? The other advantage of Google Drive, if you have a tablet or a phone and you want to access a document, Google Drive is relatively easy. So, what is this? LSUNG. Listing WinForms template. All right, that's what I was trying to pull up. And by the way, those of you that were wondering about, I haven't put in all of the fields in the forms yet. I found out that Lindsay, when she coordinates one of your transactions, will put in your name and the name of the property in all the fields for you. So you don't have to learn how to do that. Well, where are we? Lead-based paint, market conditions advisory. Did we talk about that? No? So everybody remember how to find the forms? Again, if we go up here and we type in market, we'll see if we find it. Market conditions advisory. We click on it. And I believe it's a mistake for you not to be prepared to explain how to fill out the form or what the form means. I know that there are many agents that just dump the forms on a client and say, sign here, sign there. And one of the things we're going to be talking more about in future whatever is the difference in the personality styles, right? And so a high D is going to just say, tell me where to sign, right? A high C is going to want a few days to read it, right? A high E is going to want a few days to sign it, right? A high F is going to want a few days to read it, right? A high G is going to want a few days to read it, right? A high I is going to want a few days to read it, right? A high G is going to want a few days to read it, right? A high H is going to want a few days to read it, right? A high I is going to want a few days to read it, right? A high J is going to want a few days to read it, right? A high K is going to want a few days to read it, right? A high L is going to want a few days to read it, right? A high M is going to want a few days to read it, right? A high N is going to want a few days to read it, right? A high O is going to want a few days to read it, right? A high O is going to want a few days to read it, right? A high P is going to want a few days to read it, right? A high Q is going to want a few days to read it, right? A high R is going to want a few da right? And they're going to underline things and write notes on the side. If you try to get a high C to sign a form without reading it, you're going to have, you might break the relationship, right? And if you try to make a high D read everything, right, they'll be pushing you out of the window. Market conditions, basically what this is saying is that it gives you a definition of what a competitive market is, what is a cool market, buyer considerations. Notice it says you're responsible for determining the price you want to offer for a property. It says we're going to give you comps and things like that, but that you need to be sure. Notice it says all buyers should be sure they are comfortable with the price they're offering, the price they're accepting in the counteroffer. You should be aware of and think about the following. If your offer is accepted, and I think it's missing an O there, the property's value may not increase and may even decrease. If your offer is accepted, you may have buyer's remorse that you paid too much. If your offer is rejected, there can be no guarantee that you'll find a similar property. I thought we talked about this.
I think so.
Right, and then it talks about the problem of non-contingent offers and inspection contingencies. And we're in a market where, the conversation is how bad do you want to buy this house? It says the broker recommends that you not write a non-contingent offer even if you're planning on paying all cash. Now, that may mean that they may not get that property, but it's up to them. Going through this will at least result in a conversation about the risks. I was active in the market when we were writing up 100% offers, 100% financing, right? Stated income, 100% financing. It was wonderful. And in stated income, what the loan agent would do is calculate on their calculator how much income somebody would need to qualify for the loan, show it to the borrower, who would then copy it down on the application as a representation if that was their income, right? Which is one of the reasons they have more rules now than they did back then. And everybody thought prices were going to just keep going up, and they did, until they didn't anymore. So that's something that you ought to read, and I believe that you ought to read it. If you're not a high C, but you know somebody that is, it always seems like spouses, one of them is a high D and one is a high C. That seems like, generally, not always, but if it is, you might ask them to read it and make a list of questions they would ask you, right? If this looks all good to you, you should be prepared for that. The transfer disclosure statement. This is very tedious.
Cute.
I'm sorry. Transfer disclosure statement, we're going to add that. Now, one of the suggestions about here it is. It popped right up, and I was too quick. So the transfer disclosure statement. The first part is relatively, easy. You put in the date that you're doing it, but one of the things that is oftentimes overlooked has to do with the section 1, coordination with other disclosure forms. And it says that it's made 1102 of the Civil Code, other statutes may have substituted disclosures. Substituted disclosures. The following disclosures and other disclosures required by law, including the natural hazard report statement that may include airport annoyances, earthquake, fire, flood, or assessments, have or will be made in connection with real estate transfer, are intended to satisfy the disclosure obligations on this form where the subject matter is the same. So what that's saying is that if we get all the inspections and reports, including the NHD, including the environmental, including everything, and we check the boxes here, right? And one of the things, it's not letting me check boxes. I've noticed that that's sometimes a problem with this form, is that it doesn't allow us to check the boxes. Right? Is this only me, or is it only Chrome? It's everybody. It's everybody. So what they want you to do is to print it out and add in boxes. Is there a way we could, there's too many boxes here to do it. It's possible to add little boxes. But this is something that the seller is supposed to spend some time and think about. And so I would check inspection reports completed pursuant to the contract for sale or deposit or receipt for deposit. So what this is saying is that all future inspections that are gotten are going to be included in this. And the other one is where you would check that if you already had disclosures made in reports done prior to the filling out of the transfer disclosure statement. So you would write in the, structural pest control, roof, chimney, whatever. Additional disclosures and reports. Right, wouldn't we want all those other things to be included? Notice, I don't want to beat it to death, but that it intended to satisfy the disclosure obligations on this form where the subject matter is the same. Now, what that would mean in a practical sense is that if the seller did not check a box, failed to disclose that there was a leaky plumbing, right, or something like that, but it was caught by the property inspector or the termite inspector and appeared on their reports, that disclosure would be incorporated into this form. Did that make sense what I just said?
Yes.
All right, so if we miss something, but the property inspector finds it, if we've checked those boxes, the property inspector's findings are included in this form. Otherwise, the transfer disclosure statement may be, in fact, incomplete. Right? And by the way, how long if the seller finds something, if they fail to disclose something and they later determine that they can have an amendment to the transfer disclosure statement, what happens when you amend the transfer disclosure statement to the buyer's right to cancel? 3 days, right? I had a client once, I listed this house in 95136. The guy was a contractor, right? And he knew the property was clean, he didn't want to termite, he didn't want to pay for inspections because he had inspected it, right? He's a contractor. So the termite inspector is doing the inspection for the buyer. This is one of the few where I didn't have everything up front because the contractor promised he had inspected everything and was stand by it. And the agent representing the buyer called me up and wanted to know about water under the house, right? And so I said to the other agent, are you saying there's a leak under this house? And she said, no, there's a lake under the house. Right, all we needed were some koi fish and some, and so I asked the guy, I called him up and I said, leak under the house. And he said, oh, do you mean under the kitchen? And I said, as a matter of fact, that's where it is. He says, oh yeah, well, the dishwasher just drains down there. And I pointed out to him that on the part of the transfer disclosure statement where they asked him if there were any known leaks, he said, the contractor said no, right? And what can happen, by the way, if they call it a defective transfer disclosure statement, if the disclosure is not made and incorporated into it, the buyer has the right to rescind. Do you know what that really means? Now, I'm not talking about just backing. Let's say the contract closes, and then the buyer figures out that this occurred. Rescind means we want our money back. You can have the deed back. Right? So this is serious stuff. They've made this easier than it used to be because it goes down rather than across. In the old days, it used to go across, so it sort of goes down. And if you look at the way it goes down, it sort of makes sense. Do you have a range? Do you have an oven? Do you have a microwave? That means built in. Right? I don't know if I should. A dishwasher. Right, that means a built-in one, and you just check all the boxes. That part is relatively easy. Are there any of the seller's knowledge that are not in operating condition, yes or no? The answer is yes. They have to describe what's wrong. Now, some of this comes up on the seller property questionnaire, but anyhow, are you aware of any significant defects or malfunctions? They mark it if installation of a listed appliance, device, or amenity is not a precondition of sale of the dwelling. So what that's saying is that installation of a listed appliance, device, or amenity is not a precondition of sale or transfer of the dwelling, which means that just because things are checked here doesn't necessarily mean you get them. All right, doesn't necessarily mean you get them. That's something that you can argue about in the purchase contract. And there's more that you could read, and then there's this long list of check boxes. And every once in a while I would see an agent that would just drag no all the way down to the bottom, which is sort of difficult because there's such things as shared fences, which I don't know very many homes that don't have them. There's easements that might have, anyhow, there's going to probably be some yeses as you go down here. They ask about zoning violations, neighborhood noise problems, and other nuisances. When people will say, well, should I, there's a dog that barks sometimes, should I put that down?
Yep.
The answer is yes. The neighbor's kids has a band and they practice at night in the garage. Yes. Pretty much anything is yes.
Well, everybody has a gardener these days, right? So yes, there's noise.
There's noise. Lawsuits, and then a lot of this is pretty self-explanatory. And then it says, indeed, the seller is going to certify that it's in compliance with the health and safety code, which means operable smoke detectors approved and installed in accordance with the fire marshal's regulation, compliance with the health and water heater tank. Now this used to be a separate form. Right, we used to do a separate form about smoke detectors and water heaters. It's now incorporated into the transfer disclosure statement. You'll see agents that are going to find all the old forms and include them too. My theory is that there's no reason to include a form that is word for word the same as what's already included. But I wouldn't argue with an agent who gives you them, just go ahead and sign them. Then agent's inspection disclosure, and we would notice the first one, see attached AVID. In our market, you're going to do an AVID, right? Agents, I've seen agents check, agent notes the followings, and they would type in, I am not an expert or property inspector, right? And then they would put that in. And I would have conversations with the agents, because this is an 1102 of the California Civil Code, and it doesn't say that the agent is exempt if they don't consider themselves to be an expert or a property inspector. It doesn't, there's no exemption for that. So you don't want to put in, can I say stupid statements like that, right? Because, and I don't mean if you've done that and you worked elsewhere, I don't mean, there are agents that are trained. I know brokers that tell agents to write that in. I am not a property inspector. I recommend you get a property inspection. And that's what they put in for their disclosures under the transfer disclosure statement, which is not good enough. Right, you're just hoping that it never goes to court, because a lawyer is going to, it won't be pretty. Then there's the seller property questionnaire. Why don't we, PROPERTY. And again, getting all of these in one property, PROPERTY. How about that? And, all right, how about if I just put an SPQ? Sometimes it does this sometimes, and I'm not sure why. So I'm going to go back, select library. I'm sure, there we go. I must have, sometimes I just make random selections. And then the form should follow, yes.
Good question. So how long do the buyers have if things do go sideways and things are discovered that weren't disclosed? How long can they go after the sellers?
Well, there's two parts to that question. The section 1102 of the California Civil Code relating to transfer disclosure statements gives them 2 years.
Okay.
So you have 2 years to sue under a defective transfer disclosure statement.
Okay.
That doesn't mean that they're limited to 2 years. The law relating to purchase agreements is 4 years, but then courts sometimes, that's the statute of limitations, but then courts will sometimes rule that it's within 4 years of discovery, not necessarily 4 years of the action. And even the 2 years for the transfer disclosure can be 2 years from discovery. So if the seller is really good about hiding something and it takes more than 2 years for the buyer is remodeling, this is a case that happens unfortunately often, is the buyer is remodeling and then they find that there's evidence of a fire, right? Which the seller never, so there was a fire, the seller patched it up and then didn't disclose that. And 3 years later, they're remodeling the kitchen and the contractor says, hey, look at this, because when they tear off the walls, you can tell that there had been a fire. And so it's not like, gotcha, it's been more than 2 years. You could sue at that moment. Yes.
What about properties that are sold where there is no disclosures?
Property that's sold where there is no disclosures, there are very few properties that are sold that are exempt from the transfer disclosure law. Very few. Probate, sales, trustee sales. Now, by a trustee sale, I don't mean a inter vivos trust or a living trust being sold, but a foreclosure sale, interspousal transfers. It's a very limited range, but this is a minimum that's required on a sale of a 1 to 4 unit residential property in the state of California, no matter what. Doesn't matter if it's owner occupied, doesn't matter if the sellers live there. There used to be investors that would say never lived there, so I can't answer the questions. The 1102 does not say you're exempt if you didn't live there, right? You still have to answer certain questions. That's one of the problems of doing it as is. I mean, not as is, without disclosures. The seller property questionnaire. Now, I've heard people say that there's another form called the SSD, which is the seller's statutory disclosures. And I've seen where they've done both, which I think is sort of ridiculous because notice 5A, which is on the seller property questionnaire, statutorily or contractually required disclosures. Those are the questions that are in the SSD. So if you do both, basically you're including a form that isn't necessary. And I understand that there are some agents that figure I might as well go through the CAR zip file and find every form and include it, because why not? I'm protecting myself, including agency confirmation. Agency confirmation is a separate form, but it's also already part of the purchase contract, including the water heater and it looks amateurish. You understand? If I'm a listing agent if I see all this stuff, my conclusion is going to be you don't really know what you're doing. Right? If you ask me for both an SPQ and an SSD, my conclusion is you don't know what you're doing, right? Because all that's in the SSD is incorporated into the SPQ, right?
So you only have one or the other?
Usually only one or the other, and the reason that we have two different ones is the SPQ sort of assumes that the person has lived in the property and knows something about it. The SSD is what's minimally sufficient legally to get away with. So if the investor says, I've never lived in the property, I've never seen it, they fill out the SSD. If I were a listing agent, I would tell you that you're not getting an SPQ. And you're certainly not getting the PRDS seller supplemental checklist. Right? We're just not going to give it to you because the guy doesn't live there, doesn't know. I actually have had agents say, well, why don't you fill it out for him? And it's like, you just don't understand, right? So this is the seller property questionnaire is the CAR version of the PRDS seller supplemental checklist. It's not as bad or as thorough. How about that? It's not bad, thorough. So the following representations are made by seller unless otherwise specified in writing. Broker and any other real estate licensee or other person working through the broker has not verified information provided by the seller. So do you understand when somebody says, well, why don't you help them fill it out? Why don't you fill it out for them? No, this is supposed to be what the seller thinks. A real estate broker is qualified to advise on real estate transactions, If a seller or buyer desires legal advice, they should talk to an attorney. I wonder why they put that in there. Note to the seller. Now remember, we have, as part of our group of disclosure, sort of a note about the TDS, which is basically be honest and tell everything. And so this is a note to the seller. Now again, the reason that you are going to want to be able to summarize this is because you're going to meet with people that are high Ds and they're not going to want to read, right? You know people that don't ever read the instructions, right? They just open up the box, start taking out parts, and try to put them together, right? So actual knowledge and recollection, something you do not consider maybe significantly, maybe perceived differently by a buyer. So somebody says, well, I don't mind the freeway noise. And it kind of reminds me of when I lived near the beach, right? You know, I think of the freeway noise like the roar of the ocean, right? So I've had people say that. And that's probably not the way the buyer's going to see it, right? And read the questions, take your time. So in my system, I would drop this off. The idea is that when you're on a listing appointment, you get the listing, get them to sign the listing, and then you give them all of these forms and give them a few days to fill them out. And I've had people grab a pen and they say, let's do it now. Generally, it's better, that seems like a high D to me, but that seems it's generally better to give it to them and let them think about it. And then to make an appointment to come back and do them. The other reason is that if they start filling them out, they may decide they don't want to sell their house. The note to the buyer, the purpose is to give you information about known material or significant items. The seller may not think it's BMI, that's body mass index. Isn't that what that stands for?
Absolutely.
It could be.
What is the CAR form, BMI?
You mentioned one of those forms before.
Yeah, our lawyer mentions it too.
Oh, at the beginning. Okay, when you talk with the buyer in terms of what
Buyer
they-
material issues,
Yeah.
right? So I would say this adds to the argument that you might want to use the form with the buyer.
Have you used it?
Yeah,
Does it scare people off?
no, it's just basically, the way I use the form is when I'm talking to a buyer about what they're looking for, I would have that form out. And by the way, the buyer representation agreement, I would have those forms on the table and I would start writing on them. All right. And sometimes they'd say, what is that? And I'd say, well, I'd like to take notes on the proper location. And this is a form, the buyer material issues is just to make sure we know what's important to you. That's all that it is. By the way, do you think it's possible that a buyer who you've given a copy of this to might ask you, what is that form? And you say BMI, let me see, BMI. Broker makes, no, that's not right. Broken, I don't know. I have no idea.
Mike, other than location, what other items would you write in that box?
What box?
There's a large text box under the BMI.
Well, what other things, in the BMI, what would be some of the things that would be a material issue? Location may be one, but let's be more specific. One of the things that I suggest when I do how to do a buyer consultation is to uncover what is referred to as the buyer's dominant buying motive. Now, if somebody said, I want to live 8 miles from Apple, within an 8-mile radius of Apple, I would say, all right, that's great. Got that, write it down. So what you're saying is if I find a house that meets exactly what you're looking for and is at a really good price, but it's 10 miles away, you don't even want me to tell you about it. Is that what you're saying? You don't even want to hear about it.
Yeah.
And then a lot of times you say, well, no, that's close enough. How about 15?
Would you mention good schools above a certain API?
That would be another, you have to find, will some people sacrifice bedrooms, bathrooms, and square footage to be in the right school district,
Oh, sure,
right? So that's the dominant buying motive,
right.
right? There's people that would buy anything in the Cupertino School District. No matter, they got 5 kids, they'll buy a 1-bedroom, they'd buy a 1-bedroom condo, right? I'm almost not kidding about that.
No, I hear you.
So the idea is to identify what the dominant buying motives are and to write them on that form because notice it's making a reference to the form, and we might want to match it up, right? If something is, be sure to put your concerns and questions in writing. Right, yes.
So the BMI in the form, it has a place for the property address.
No. Does it?
Looking at- Yeah,
Well, it can. I would fill it out before the property address.
of course, so then.
But
you
then you could put in the property address. The thing is, you may do it more than once. I guess it does have a place for the property address. I'll take
I'm
your.
just trying to think of where to place it when talking to buyers, because they need to sign on this, and then I'm gonna sign on it, and it's incomplete, meaning without a property address.
Well, what we can do, however, is right, has made or is contemplating. That part, what I would do is fill it out. You want them to sign it when you could have them sign it when you're writing up the offer. But I would write it out in advance. And you're going to find that what they say they're looking for will change over time. Right? Because somebody who says, I only want to be within 8 miles of Apple in Sunnyvale, at some point may decide they can't afford to be within 8 miles. So this is a living document in that sense. But yes, you can. I would be sure to do it is contemplating. But you want this to match up. You want it to match up.
And for legal purposes, if they're contemplating, would that be enough? Because this also states that, if you didn't come up with a reason or something that's important to you, you can't come up with it later. So they're contemplating on making an offer, and then they end up writing 10 offers. Is one form sufficient?
Well, I'm not sure there's a reason why the address would be that important, because if these are their material issues, I think you could do it anyhow. The issue, a lot of what we do in a different lifetime, which it really seems like, I went to law school, and the contracts professor started off by saying what his name was, and then he said that there's nothing magical about a contract. Right? This is the contracts professor in law school. And the point that he was making is that we write contracts and do all this to avoid litigation, sometimes more so than to create a right to litigate. Right? So if they've written down what's important to them and then left it off, this is like, if you've ever watched an English crime drama, right, they'll say, you're not obligated to talk to us, but if you don't and then later bring something up, that could be held against you because you had a right to mention it now, right? It's the same idea, because they were given an opportunity to express what was important to them. And if they don't say something and then later come up with it, they're going to have more difficulty in court because it wasn't on the list. And so that's more, and by the way, sometimes we put that kind of information in a buyer-broker agreement where you could, there's a little space where you could write in what they're looking for.
Mm-hmm. And this is just the difference between this and just taking down your own notes when talking to them on a buyer consultation. The difference is just the signature.
The difference is it's the signature and the fact that it's an actual form.
Okay.
And it's referred to in the seller property questionnaire. And the lawyers will say that if they ever get you as an agent and you're representing a buyer and they get you in court, they're going to ask to see your copy of the buyer material issue form. And when you say, I don't have one, or you say, what's that? And they say, well, did you notice that it was referred to in the seller property questionnaire? And you say, really? Right? Gee, and the lawyer says, haven't you ever read the seller property questionnaire? And I guess not, right? You understand this isn't looking good, right? So that's why the form will help you if you're in a court, right? Because it's specifically referred to. But you could, there was a time when it didn't exist. And we used to just include the information in a buyer-broker agreement. But they did it because people would sue. Anyhow, that's, the rest of that is fairly self-explanatory, I think. Seller's affidavit of non-foreign status. I hate this. I really don't. So, affidavit. Qualified. Seller's affidavit of non-foreign status. 1, 2, 3, and 4. Now, oh man. So, this is the form. By the way, the title company is going to probably make the seller fill out their own form anyhow. Just doesn't really mean, the title company, when they're in their filling out form mode, is going to slide one of these over to the seller and say, fill it out. Right? They're going to do it. And I would like to think efficient agent, although lazy might be, another word. I used to not bother with it because I knew they were going to have to fill it out anyhow. Right, we want you to get a copy of it filled out. Now, it talks about, does everybody understand what this form is about?
No, I was just gonna ask you that, sorry.
All right, well, no, that's a good thing. The revenue provides that a transfer of U.S. real, let me just say it plainly. If you are not a citizen of the United States
Okay.
and or a resident of California, right, there's actually two parts to this. One is that if you're not a citizen of the United States, you're a non-resident alien, what they're afraid of is that you're going to sell the property, owe capital gains, and take the money and get on and book it to back to your homeland, and they'll never get their money. Right? So that's the federal concern. Right? And this is all, what's the name of the law that this is related to? Not Megan's Law. FIRPTA, right? FIRPTA. And by the way, the CAR has in their legal section brochures on FIRPTA. So that's one issue, is you're not a citizen of the United States. The state of California, however, has a different concern. That may be that you're a resident of Nevada and you're going to sell property in California and forget to pay your taxes in California, and you're going to book it to Nevada, right? So California has their own rule. They have their own rule. So that's the whole idea, and they want to know, who are you? That's sort of what this is about. And note, in order to avoid withholding, and we could look at FIRPTA. I didn't really think I was going to talk about FIRPTA, but you could download the brochure from CAR. But basically what it says is that the buyer which means escrow, is supposed to withhold. You're not supposed to get all the money. Right? If the seller does not fill out this form, the seller is not going to get all the money when the property sells, because a certain amount is going to be withheld in escrow until the IRS is convinced that you're not a foreigner that's taking the money and leaving. Now, the part of this that causes concern is this part here: Social Security number or federal employer ID number. Right? Now, do you understand that if you fill this out, and I believe you can write in to be provided at escrow. I'd have to ask Mr. Sibilia what his preference is. But does everybody understand what the issue could be giving a buyer, or how about this, making this part of the boilerplate disclosures that you've put on the internet? I, by the way, have done searches. I don't know if you knew this, but if you search, one of the Google searches you can do is file type :PDF. And you'll find copies of real estate agents' disclosures that they've posted on some website that's indexed by Google that anybody could download, and it includes this form with the Social Security number of the seller. Right now, at this point, do you understand why I sort of said, well, why don't we just wait for the title company to do it? Now, Lindsay's probably going to say, I want a copy of the form, so you could black it out or not provide it to the buyer. But you understand this is getting their Social Security number and broadcasting it. Provide. Now it says, in order to avoid withholding, IRS Section 4 requires that the seller provide this affidavit to the buyer with the seller's identification number, or provides this affidavit including the seller to a qualified substitute. Any idea who a qualified substitute might be? Escrow company. Right? Who furnishes a statement to the buyer under penalty of perjury that the qualified substitute has such an affidavit in their possession. So we're going to want this form, and we're going to want to give it to escrow, even though they're probably going to make the seller fill out their own. Right? They're word for word the same, but you know how they are. But the idea that you're going to get the seller's social security number, write it on the form, and put it on the internet for people to look at, I wouldn't do that. Okay? And it says a qualified substitute could be an attorney, title company, or escrow company, but not the seller's agent, not the listing agent. You're not a qualified substitute responsible for closing the transaction. Right? So you'll have to see what Lindsay does if you don't write that number in. But I didn't, you can see I just said, why mess with this? But I think it's on our list. And so we have all the sellers. Notice what it says on the list here. You need one for each seller. So we go ahead and we get it, but we don't give it to everybody that's interested. Federal law, and then there's California law, and so they're just asking questions. I, the undersigned, declare under penalty of perjury the reason, check below, if any, I am exempt. So one reason that you could be exempt under the federal law is that if you're not a non-resident alien. So an alien is somebody who's not a citizen under federal law. Or a non-resident means that you could be an alien, but a resident alien. California law, I understand, declare under penalty of perjury, I am exempt. Total sales of the property is $100,000 or less. Right? Not very often. The property qualifies as my principal residence. If being sold within the meaning of IRS Section 121, owned and occupied for 2 of the last 5 years. Does everybody understand what that is referring to?
Rental property.
I'm going to go with Georgia on this one.
It's the capital gains thing, if you live there, right, 2 out of the last 5 years, you
Right.
have the capital gains.
If you're married and filing a joint return, and it's your principal residence, and you used it as such for 2 out of the last 5 years, you get how much of an exemption? 500,000. Right? Does that apply to rental properties? No. Could it?
If you lived there
If you
before,
lived in
yeah.
there before and then you turn it into a rental.
Or what some sellers, I used to have, I had this one client, God bless them, they had 2 rental properties and a personal residence, so I listed and sold their personal residence, and they moved into 1 rental property. 2 years later, sold it. And then that gave them another $500,000 exemption, moved into their 3rd rental property. You understand, this is like being a dentist and with a kid that's addicted to candy, right? You understand, because you know they're coming back, right? And then they sold the 3rd one after they lived there for 2 years, and they got another $500,000 exemption. And if you're single and not filing a joint return, you get $250,000, right? So if it's their personal residence, you check that box. The property was last used my personal residence within the meaning of IR without regard to the 2-year time anyhow. That's the transaction would result in 0 gain for California income tax purposes. And there's a form they would want. 0 gain would mean that you're not getting a capital gain. You fill out the form. Property's been or involuntary converted. Involuntary conversion, that's what happens when you marry a Catholic. Wait a second, that may not be right. That's so if you're not, most of these you never end up checking, right? But the properties will be exchanged. A 1031 exchange is an exception. It's an installment sales an exception. And then this is this 3 1/3 is the withholding that is required under FERPTA. See, here's another reference to FERPTA, but that's the one that's required under California law if they don't qualify. I've never had a listing that didn't, where they had to withhold. And I know anyhow. And so then here's the federal guidelines. You might want to read this. This is something people are going to ask you about maybe. But wasn't that fun? What? No? There's a little brochure on FERPTA, which the CAR makes. I'm pretty sure that's still true. We'll look before we go. Statewide buyer and seller advisory. This is a boilerplate, everything in the kitchen sink kind of a STATEWIDE, statewide. Maybe if I spell it right, statewide. And then, how come it does this to me? So, statewide. Well, I don't know why it does this, but sometimes it just does this. Okay.
It came up real quick for me, just statewide, and then I hit return.
I know it's knows that you're watching. So. Now this is a boilerplate. If you represent the seller, you're going to want to get this done in advance and give it to them being the buyer, in advance. And it has a bunch of buyer's rights and duties. It has seller's rights and duties, broker rights and duties, inspections. It basically says you ought to inspect everything. I got into the habit of, if they were not going to do an inspection, that they would have to mark no. And I eventually got to the point where I had them initial next to where they said no, so that they couldn't argue later that they didn't remember clicking no. Do you understand that we don't know how big buildings are? I don't know if you knew that. Right? The square footage. If you have two appraisers appraise the same house, they oftentimes will come up with different square feet. Right? And one of the curious things I've noticed is over time, buildings seem to grow. They get bigger. Right? Because I can remember when they were being sold and they were 1407 square feet, and then now they're 1425, and they haven't added anything, and it always says the seller. But square footage, the buyer needs to know that what's stated in the MLS and what's stated in the title records may in fact not be accurate. And what sometimes, by the way, there's sometimes you can't avoid this, but when the appraiser comes in with a lower square footage, sometimes buyers want a price reduction based upon the lower square footage. They'll say, well, 50 square feet. They'll say, well, we were offering X number of dollars per square feet, and it's 100 square feet less. So we want you to knock off the price, which the seller is not necessarily interested in. Right? I think that Pam did a session one time where she took everybody to watch how if you've ever watched them measure a house, you'll understand it's not an exact science, right? You'd think so. When they measure the square footage, is it the inside of the house or the outside of the house?
Outside.
It's the outside of the house. What about the garage?
No.
So it's not included. So how do they deduct, how do they deduct the garage?
Probably measure it and then deduct the.
Then they measure and then they deduct. Can everybody understand that figuring out how much of the perimeter is garage and how much is not garage, you could be off by a little bit, right? So I mean, it just, and our boundaries are the fences, the boundary lines?
Not necessarily.
Not necessarily. Did the people who put up the fence, were those engineers using engineering equipment? I don't know, I was about to say something, but or were these people that were grabbed standing outside of Home Depot one morning and bussed over there in a van and given and told to put up a fence, right? So the boundary line is not necessarily the fence. If you really care, you could have a survey done, right? Which costs at least $1,000, right? If they really care. But fences are not necessarily that's not necessarily where it is. Representations regarding these items are made in the multiple listing service advertisements and for property are often approximations or based upon inaccurate or incomplete records. By the way, if you're representing a buyer, would it be good for you to not just give them this form and have them sign it and turn it in, but to actually discuss it with them? May not represent boundary lines. By the way, there is a certain point, there was and it was a Coldwell Banker. Coldwell Banker gets sued more often because they have one broker. For most of their offices, it's one broker. So it appears more often. It's not necessarily, I'm not sure they're actually being sued more often, but because there's one broker, it appears more often. And there was a case involving a Coldwell Banker agent who sold a house and the MLS said 5,000 square feet. And so seller says 5,000 square feet, they say the agent representing the buyer buys the house, and then a few years later the buyer is selling the house and has another agent looking at it, and the other agent walked in, looked around and said, no way is this 5,000 square feet, no way. And so then they had it measured, and it was like 3,700 square feet. And they sued the agent because the agent was off by so much, right? And so there's a certain point where you're not. There wasn't an appraisal done of the property. There wasn't. There wasn't an appraisal done. There was no measurement done. The seller. What is the seller going to say? Why did the seller put down 5,000? Because when they bought it, that's what it said, right? So this is like child abuse that gets passed on from generation to generation. Sometimes it's 3 or 4 generations, and then finally somebody says this is just not right. They have an appraisal done, they have it measured, and then they sue. And by the way, this is a good reason to preview property a lot, because if you preview enough property, you'll be able to walk into one and look around. You said you don't have to be close, but you ought to know when it's 1,300 square feet off, right? You understand? It's like an entire house. Soil and geological conditions, geographic, environmental hazards. Remember, there's that report, right, that you can get as part of the natural hazard disclosure. There's the guide, lead-based paint, formaldehyde, mold, water intrusion, septic systems. If you are representing a buyer who's buying a property with a well or a septic, you need to get a well and a septic inspection, and they're expensive, but you need to get one. By the way, did you realize that there are houses in Campbell with septic tanks?
No.
Yeah. There's houses in Campbell and septic tanks. When they were building the subdivisions in Campbell, they were doing it so fast back in those days, in the 50s and 60s. They were doing it so fast that they hadn't put in sewer yet. And so they were putting septic tanks in the back of the houses, and then they dug the line for the sewer, and they would come and knock on everybody's door and say, do you want to be connected to the sewer? And some people said no. The septic tank's fine. No. Right? Now, can you tell by looking at the house if it's connected to the sewer or not? No. Can you just assume that because it's in Campbell that it mustn't be connected to you can't always assume that. All right? So if it's got, sometimes there's a patch in the backyard that's a little greener than the rest. But yeah, anyhow, or depending, or browner. So where would you find that information? How could somebody prove that they're connected?
Environmental health.
Environmental. Do you have to pay is there a sewer bill?
Right, but they would see whether it's recorded.
Do they record where they put in septic tanks?
They do in Santa Cruz County.
But not in, there's no, you could look at the records in Campbell and it wouldn't show you they have a septic tank, but you're paying a sewer bill. Right? If you were a buyer, would you want to see, if you represented the buyer, would you want to see copies of their utility bills, including, I think it's on the garbage, water and sewer, you'd want to see it. And if they said the dog ate it, we lost it, we don't keep copies of it.
Can you go online and check it out?
No.
No, nothing? I mean,
I don't know that. I don't know if you could go to it may be that we've progressed, that you could pull this up from county records. I haven't tried. But this is if there is a septic tank, you want the buyer to know. Well, and water systems, also an issue. Wood destroying pests. I don't know if we need to talk about a termite. You ought to get a termite inspection. I think even if people ask me if we're buying a condo, should we get a structural pest? And the answer is yes. Does everybody understand? You understand there's two parts of it? Section 1 and Section 2, and even Section 1 has two parts, right?
It's termites and then there's.
Wood destroying pests and organisms, which include
The
termites or pests.
carpenter beetles or whatever they're called.
There were wood boring. Santa Clara County has termites and wood boring beetles. Those are the two that we have that eat wood. But wood destroying organisms are microorganisms that are eating the wood. Not mold. Not mold. Mold is not rot and begins with an F. Fungus. There's a fungus among us, right? So fungus is actually eating the wood. Mold is not eating the wood. And anyhow, it's good to get one of those reports. Section 1 means that there are wood destroying pests and organisms. Section 2 identifies areas where there are conditions likely to lead to those infestations or infections.
So mold would be discovered through this, and then anything additional, you can get a mold report.
You can get a mold inspection, the property inspector, and sometimes the people who do termite inspections will do a mold inspection too,
Okay.
right? I mean, they're looking at the same stuff.
Yeah.
It's just that technically, I remember calling Able Exterminators, which is a company I used, because one of my clients had a infestation of wasps. And it's Able Exterminators, and they said, no, we're not gonna do anything. And I said, why? I mean, we're offering to pay them, right, to kill wasps. And they said, no. And I said, why not? And they said, they don't eat wood. I'm like, why do you call yourselves you're not very able exterminators, but they specialize in only wood. Now I think some of them are more flexible.
2 years I had one in my chimney. You know what I got told? Oh, we can't because now there's not enough of them.
There's not enough of them.
I'm like, jeez.
So, but you might need to get a mold inspection if that's a whole different issue. Earthquake, fault zones, fire hazards, flood hazards, zone maps, building permits, and zoning and code compliance. Is it possible to pull the permits? If you were a buyer, would you want to do that?
No.
What? If you were the buyer?
Or if I'm the buyer, yeah.
Well, not as the realtor. If the buyer was interested, could you give them a link to the place where they could go pull the permits? Buyer and seller advise that any structure on the property, including the original structure and additions, modifications, remodel, or improvement, may have been built without permits, not according to building codes. Buyer is advised to check with appropriate government agency, the third party, to verify this. Brokers recommend that buyer discuss the issue with an appropriate professional. Brokers do not have expertise in this area. But they may want, what you can be is the source of the information, even if you're not the information. All right.
So Mike, because this paragraph is in here, does that mean that the sellers, is there any other form where the sellers need to specify that, yes, we had an additional?
Transfer disclosure statement and the seller property questionnaire both ask questions about that.
Okay.
So they've been asked if they've done it.
Not a permit.
They're also asked if they know of any things that are unpermitted.
Okay.
All right, so pets in the property, I don't want to get into that really, but neighborhood area, personal factors, most of this, are they growing marijuana? Do they have a meth lab? They should stop while you're showing the property. And mellow roots, homeowner associations, most of this, we're just, I don't know. What else do we want to, this is like everything in the kitchen sink. I would read it. Home warranty, I recommend, I always got the seller to put one on the property while it was during the listing. I think you've heard me talk about that, yeah.
What if my flip, what if he had everything done, it's brand new, so they have a warranty already on,
The home warranty is good for 1 year.
so is
It may not be transferable.
Okay,
You need to talk to the home warranty company,
okay.
right? But it may not be find out if it's transferable. All right, and then modus supplemental property tax bill, does everybody understand what that is? No, I'm going on too long, but, that the buyer is going to end up probably getting a bill. All right, so let's say the seller has paid the taxes to the end of the fiscal year, which is June 30th. It's at today's assessed value. Buyer buys the property, and the property will be reassessed at the price the buyer paid. The difference between the reassessment and the existing assessment will result in supplemental property taxes. The buyer is going to get a bill for the difference. Maybe not everybody understands this, right? And when the buyer gets a bill in the mail asking for thousands of dollars in a supplemental property tax, who are they going to call?
They called me.
They called you.
And I was like, what?
Right. And so there's this notice, and so would this be a good thing to discuss with them so that they know that this is coming up? Non-confidentiality of offers, that's what the listing agreement says. They could tell FERPTA, California withholding, this explains that affidavit. Liquidated damages, what that essentially says is that if they back out of the contract and they don't have a just cause or a reason that's supported in the contract, they could lose their deposit. All right?
How do you implement that?
By implement, it means that it eventually, first of all, it will sit in escrow until the buyer and the seller sign a piece of paper. Three things have to happen. One of three things. One, the buyer and the seller each sign a form that releases the money to somebody, splits it, gives it to the buyer, gives it to the seller. Two, it goes to arbitration, the arbitration awards it. Or three, it goes to a court and the court rules on it. Those are otherwise the money will sit in escrow. Right, so it isn't an automatic forfeiture, right? Unless the buyer signs a form releasing the money to the seller can't get it. And that escrow company is not gonna have two escrows pending on the same property, so if you wanna sell it to somebody else, you have to open up another escrow. But that's a problem because this one isn't closed. Mediation, arbitration, Megan law, and death on the property, it says if it's occurred more than 3 years, they don't have to tell you. The seller statutory disclosures asks, has anyone died in the last 3 years? If the buyer asks the seller, they're not allowed to lie. They're not allowed to lie. But there's no affirmative duty to disclose a death if it's been more than 3 years.
Who came up with 3 years? Where'd that number?
The 3 years is a standard. 3 years is the amount of time for an encroachment. There's a whole bunch of things that are 3 years. They just pick 3 years. There was a case that this came from called Reed versus King, and it was like 8 or 11 years before when somebody had died. And so, anyhow, I had a person. I haven't heard anybody else with this story, but I had a listing where somebody died in it while it was listed.
Oh, geez.
So I've had people tell me I win the worst listing.
Yeah.
And so I was there when the police came and kicked in the door because the doors were locked and there was a body in one of the bedrooms. I was there that night when the widow and children showed up to get the guy's belongings.
Oh,
And so when I double-ended it, so people are coming in and I pointing out to the guy, you're right there, like 2 weeks ago, somebody died. And so I'll just finish the story, then we'll stop. So his wife is down in San Diego. She comes up, we sign all the papers, escrow closes. A year later, he's being transferred. 1 year later, I'm listing the property again. This is over on Blossom Avenue. And so I'm meeting with the husband. I haven't really met the wife before. I'm meeting with husband and wife. And I said, and of course, we're going to have to disclose about the death in the property. And she's looking at me. She says, what death in the property? So he had gotten her to sign all the forms without pointing out to her that somebody had died in the property. And so she's looking at him, what death? And he's like looking at his shoes. And then she looks at me and I said, a tenant that was in the property died when the property was being listed. And then she said, what room? And I said, he wasn't talking anymore. I said, first bedroom on the left. And she looked at him and she said, the nursery? And his explanation was, I didn't think, it would just, what difference does it make? It just would have bothered you. So, yes. But anyhow, you need to, if it's, you have an affirmative duty, it's in the SPQ and the seller statutory disclosures. If not, if